Every day, independent oil and natural gas producers are out there drilling smarter, going farther, and delivering the energy that fuels our economy and strengthens our national security. It's a side of the industry that's dynamic and foundational to how affordable, reliable energy gets made in America. This podcast is about diving into that world. We're talking tech, policy, production, and pressure points. Everything that shapes how American energy actually works. This is Longer Laterals. Welcome to another episode of Longer Laterals. I'm Anne Bradbury, the CEO of AXPC, and this is where America's energy story meets Washington. Today, I'm joined by Rob West, the founder of Thunderset Energy. Thunderset Energy is a leading energy consultancy known for its data-driven, no-nonsense analysis of global energy markets. His work is widely read by investors and industry leaders looking to understand where global energy markets are going and the intersection and interplay between energy economics and energy policies. I've been a big fan of Rob for many years now, and he brings a really unique and data-driven perspective and modeling to really complex energy questions, and I'm so thrilled to have him on the pod today. Rob, welcome to Longer Laterals.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anne. Great to be with you.
Let's start with your background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Thunderset Energy and how you came to energy?
Well, I started in energy in 2011, and at the time, oil was $110 a barrel. Gas was like, $10 an MCF. And, I joined the industry right at this time when, ExxonMobil and Cheniere were building LNG import terminals to the US. And when my team at Bernstein was projecting oil would go to $150 to $200 a barrel. And what happened, over the next 10 years is that oil and gas prices averaged 65. Gas prices came down to $2 an MCF in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And that created $800 billion of savings per year for Americans. And just in that time, the United States produced an additional 10 million barrels a day of oil. That's a Saudi Arabia of oil. It produced an extra 60 BCF a day of gas. That's an entire Russia of gas. And that was all driven by a technology. It was all driven by shale. And so it just, something that has fascinated me my whole career has been, if you get the right technology, it can change the world. And so in 2019, I created a research firm focused on energy technologies. We're in this place right now where technology is changing faster than ever. There's never been such fast technology change in the history of human civilization. And so I wanted to create a research firm focused on all these amazing technologies coming through and how we produce energy, transform energy, consume energy. And that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. And the more I've learned, the stupider I feel.
I don't know what that says about me, but because I get smarter every time I read your stuff.
Well, that shows I'm doing my job. I absorb all the stupid, and then hopefully that people who read my stuff can feel smarter.
Well, that's a great intro for, I think, the first thing I wanted to tee up for discussion. And you recently did a piece, I think it was this past fall, that is really near and dear to my heart. And it's what would the world and what would America look like if the Shale Revolution hadn't happened? And you know that my company is, we are the authors of the American Shale Revolution. It was the innovations of advanced drilling, longer laterals, hydraulic fracturing that brought about this great American energy revolution. And, we've talked sort of around what that has meant for America, but you did a really in-depth analysis of what it meant economically, what it meant from a national security perspective, what it's meant from an emissions perspective of what would have happened if these technologies were not leveraged and the American energy revolution never happened. And so I'd love to start there and do a deep dive into, first, economically, where would the American family be today if the American energy revolution, the shale revolution, had never happened?
So about 15% of the CPI is energy. About half of that is direct energy. It's when you go to the pump and fill up your car, or when you heat your home, and everybody knows, paying those bills. But then if you think, about 1% of the CPI basket is airfare, and airfare is 20% jet fuel, right? Or 30% of the CPI basket is buying stuff, various stuff from retail shops, and about 2% of the revenues of the average shop goes on their energy bill. So, there's half of it is direct, half of it is look through. And when you do that analysis of, all of the CPI basket line by line by line, and what, hydrocarbon prices, oil and gas were, and what they would have been without shale, numbers I get to is that we had about 0.7% per year less inflation for the last decade, because of shale. And
Compounded
so,
year over year.
yeah, every year inflation would have been 0.7% higher, for 10 years. And so that benefit of shale bringing deflation allowed us to pursue an expansionary monetary policy that allowed us
Mm.
to have cheaper capital for businesses, which allowed us to drive a lot of economic growth, which allowed us to, build amazing businesses that are changing the world today. It allowed the US to pursue policies towards cleaner energy. It allowed um, you know, people to have more money in their pockets. And so that's the primary economic impact that shale has had. And, um, we, I live in Europe. We see the difference of energy prices that have gone only ever up and energy prices that have gone only ever down. And, I remember talking with a chemical CEO a few years ago, said to me, "Why would you ever build another plant in Europe? Everything we build is going to be on the US Gulf Coast forever."
Wow.
You know,
Because
and so
of low energy prices there.
right, right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me as a researcher is how industry hangs together in a way that is not immediately obvious. I'll give you like one of my favorite examples. If you hold up your iPhone, the front cover of your iPhone contains a conductive yet transparent layer of a material called indium tin oxide. There it is. Look, beautiful indium tin oxide. And indium, that's kind of a weird metal. Well, it turns out that all of the indium in the world is produced as a byproduct of zinc refining.
Hmm.
And almost all of the zinc refineries in the world um, are near to steel mills, because zinc and steel go together to make galvanized steel. And then a lot of the steel mills get put next to oil refineries, because you can take the coke from the oil refinery and use it as a reducing agent in the steel mill. And so, where do you end up getting indium from? And actually all hangs together in a big industrial value chain where if you didn't have oil, you wouldn't be able to, make that amazing, transparent, conductive material on the front of an iPhone. And so all of this stuff is interlinked in a way that, is making the US Gulf Coast just boom and drive, amazing industrial clout for the United States of America.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing, and I like the connection to all of the different industries. I think farming is one you didn't mention. Energy prices and food prices are hugely interlinked. Let's do like a straight line though for like if for oil to oil, gas to gas, your projection, if the shale revolution hadn't happened, what do you think a barrel of oil might be today?
Somewhere in the range of $150 to
Yeah.
$200 a barrel.
And it's like 60-ish, yeah,
Right.
today. Gas, I think, I think you had
10
$10.
plus.
Yeah, yeah. It's about $2 to $3 today, so it's a pretty remarkable economic story.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's only one other thing in the world that is such a great driver of deflation. And, it's the topic of the day in energy, which is going to be AI and just the
Mm,
deflation that comes from AI. And then, harking back to exactly what we've been talking about, there's a reason 50% of the big AI data centers being built in the United States is because, if you want to build something over a gigawatt, um, there's actually, a few places in the world that have rule of law
mhm.
and available energy and the industrial ecosystem to do it and to support it.
Yeah. I want to come back to that in a second, but first I want to go back to your point on Europe. So you're actually sitting
Yeah,
in Europe, so you've
I
got
am. I
some
am.
firsthand knowledge of this. So while the U.S. has been investing and increasing its energy production, Europe's taken a bit of a different route, and this really kind of came to a head over the last several years with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and really exposed some of its energy dependencies. Talk just a little bit about how you've experienced that and how you've seen that and some of maybe the implications that might not be so obvious and mistakes that you think Europe may have made in their energy policy.
Oh gosh, it's going to be a long podcast, Anne. I mean, I think the I think what one of the real challenges is the you know w- well-intentioned well-intentioned goal of decarbonization. Um, I think it led Europe in particular to prioritize some technologies that just were inflationary and actually um, maybe to shut down um, low cost, um, important drivers of energy supply faster than they could be replaced by suitable alternatives. I mean, you put the German nuclear shutdown disaster in that category. I would say, as a European, it's very sad that we have shale in Europe, but in most countries we've banned the idea of even going after and producing it. Um, and you see that if you look at the demand for economic output, industrial output in Europe, and the energy consumption that goes with that. We have some of the highest energy prices in the world, and we've seen continued deterioration in our you know industrial productivity. Don't get too bleak, though. Europe still does some amazing things. Precision manufacturing, in some value chains, you look at it and leading companies are European companies. So I'm optimistic that Europe is turning a corner and is realizing that it needs to be able to stand more on its own 2 feet and compete. And I think
Mhm.
that that's just the main thing, that they don't teach people enough in school is that, we live in a competitive world. And if you make your economies uncompetitive, there will be consequences of that. And if you make your economies more competitive, there are like amazing multipliers. And just, I think, policymakers forget that at their peril, and just competitiveness should come first. Just
Yeah.
just as something should always be a consideration.
And cheap and reliable energy is really foundational to that economic competitiveness.
Yeah, yeah, energy is such an important input. Yeah.
Let's maybe shift a little bit and talk about LNG for a second. So
Okay.
I know I think of you as a big natural gas guy. I don't know if that's how you think of yourself, but very pretty bullish on LNG. So U.S. is now the biggest producer of natural gas, the biggest exporter of LNG. And still, our export capacity is expected to potentially double in the next several years. I don't know if you would agree with that, but by some estimates,
Yeah.
is what does world demand look like? Is there sufficient demand in the world, for all of that supply that is expected to come online?
Yeah. I mean, the numbers around energy inequality in the world are just absolutely startling. There's 4 billion people in the world that use 90% less energy per capita than we do. Still, 85 to 90% of all people in the world have never been on a plane. I mean, it's just amazing when you kind of add up those numbers. And so the story that, is a slightly cliched story is emerging world growth driving, something like 2 to 2.5% a year growth in useful energy demand, you know, all the way to 2050. And within that, gas growing 3 to 4% a year, and LNG being the best way of getting gas to places that need to import it. So I think that story continues. there's a really interesting debate about whether coal is maturing in regions like China. You can do numbers where by 2030, it is going to be cheaper for China to import LNG than keep mining the marginal coals. Remember, those marginal coals get 30 meters deeper every
Wow.
year. But the big challenge for the US, as I see it, is that most of the US LNG goes to Europe. It's produced on the Gulf Coast. The most natural ocean for it to go across is the Atlantic. LNG, a percentage of that cargo burns off every day it's on the water. So you want to ship it somewhere near. And, the US had kind of positioned itself as Europe's savior. We've been amazing allies for decades. And Europe, I think, felt very good about kicking out all the Russian gas after that, war of aggression in Ukraine and replacing it with LNG. And I think just the thing that I would be worried about in the LNG industry is a souring of tensions between Europe and the US over, some things that might have been the news recently. And I know that a lot of people in Europe feel very, very strongly about that and feel like these guys aren't our allies anymore. And, if you're in that world, then I think you might find that a lot of that LNG that comes to market won't be absorbed by Europe. Um, and that's why I think actually it would be really be in everybody's interests if, well, look, I'm an American, I'm a European, I would like to see mommy and daddy get along.
So the demand is there around the world, Europe and emerging economies. The question is, does geopolitical developments potentially complicate some of those relationships in
Yeah.
your mind?
Yeah. Nice summary. Nice summary.
Thank you. Thank you.
I told
um,
you, I do the stupid and you do the smart. It's
hardly. Let's shift a little bit maybe from natural gas demand, LNG to oil. There's also been, some chatter recently around IEA's revisions to oil demand over the long run in their sort of long-term demand outlook. Where do you land on long-term demand outlook for oil?
yeah. I mean, I think um, oil demand is going to peak or plateau is a better word. Um, and it'll probably be, around 2030. Probably be somewhere around 107 to 110 million barrels a day. And then, it'll go sideways. And the reason for that is that you know, EVs are going to be a part of the mix. They're going to compete. And we're going to have some lines in the oil demand build up that move sideways. And we're going to have some lines that keep growing, like jet fuel, plastics, diesel trucks. I think one of the really interesting things that's happening right now is that a lot of people are seeing oil demand come in stronger in the developed world. And it's just a great reminder that, you know, there are just hundreds of trends ongoing that shape oil demand. I mean, one of the most interesting ones happening in the US is about where people choose to live. So if you live in, I don't know, New York City or San Francisco or Washington, D.C., you probably drive 2,000, 3,000 miles a year because you live in a very dense city with amazing public transit. If you go out and move to, I don't know, Frisco, like 60 miles north of Dallas, you probably drive like 12 to 15,000 miles a year.
Easily.
And actually, that's quite interesting because what you've seen since COVID is the biggest declines in US populations have been in those dense cities that I just mentioned. And the fastest growing county with over 1 million people is Collin County, Texas, home to Frisco, and other kind of states that have big suburb, exurb kind of populations. And so, people are moving out from big cities towards areas where there's more space, where real estate is more affordable. And, that's kind of Americans doing what Americans do, which is going where they see the best opportunities for themselves. But that trend, has definitely increased oil demand, probably reaching about 1 million barrels a day of total impact now, which I just think is
That
fascinating.
is.
And it probably continues as autonomous vehicles emerge.
So the one thing we haven't talked as much about is emissions. You're a technology guy. I think there's a lot of good news around emissions, especially in the US. As we've talked about, the shale revolution happened. We've tripled our oil production, more than that of natural gas, and yet our emissions have, been declining steadily year over year over that same time. What's your view on American emissions? What's your view on global emissions? Is that a good news story, a bad news story, and where do you think it goes from here?
So those numbers you said are exactly right. I mean, that ramp up of US shale gas allowed the US to turn off over 500 million tons a year of coal production and produce it with gas that is, you know, 50 to 60% lower carbon per unit of useful energy. And so that shift has saved over 500 million tons a year of CO2. You know how the news goes. Everything is either the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. And I think the answer on emissions is in the middle. When this first came on the scene as a huge question, we were looking at, so the world is 50 billion tons a year of CO2 today. We were looking at possibly the world getting to 100 billion tons a year of CO2, in the around 2050. And there were people talking about, 6 to 8 degrees of warming. Um, and that was, that obviously is like going to be a huge problem for human civilization. Um, and so we kind of set targets, which was, right, what's the right amount of emissions? I know, zero. Zero is the right amount. I mean, like, I'd like to look, better on the beach, but eating 0 calories is not the right amount for, me and the kind of maintenance of my life. And I think it's kind of dawning on people that zero emissions is just too expensive for the world. There was a stat 40% of Americans wouldn't pay $2 a month for decarbonization. Um, Last year, like 85% of the CCS projects that I track moved backwards because it just is expensive and complicated and adds a burden to your economy and your industry. And so if I kind of look at where are we headed, where are we actually headed, emissions are going to peak. We're 50 billion tons a year today. We're going to go down to somewhere around 20 to 30 billion just because gas is economic, solar is economic, efficiency technologies allow you to do more with
Mhm.
less. We're going to take AI and deploy it in industry and find ways of doing way more cool stuff with less input. And that's going to happen in a way that benefits people and drives deflation, not inflation. And, if you do that, I'm done with climate modeling. You end up in a world where we have, between 2 and 3 degrees of warming around the year 2100. We've already had 1.5 since pre-industrial times. So you have, zero point 0.5 to 1.5 more warming. And look, it's not perfect. It's not zero. It's not getting back to, the climate we had in 1750. But it's also not like 8 degrees and, the goldfish boiling in the
Mhm.
pond. And I think the kind of pragmatic view of the world that is emerging is that we do not live in a collaborative world. Like increasingly, it feels like we live in a competitive and adversarial world where you have to be pragmatic and worry that if you like really lean in too hard towards decarbonization, other people will beat you industrially and then decide the future of your continent without you in the room. And so I think that kind of the pragmatism of 1 to 2 degrees more, or 2 to 3 degrees total, I think the pragmatism will kind of kick in and people say, it's not perfect, but it's good enough. And we need to focus on competitiveness and resiliency.
All right, Rob. Well, to wrap up this fascinating discussion, I have one last question for you, which we ask of all of our podcast guests. And that is, what is one thing about your job or the oil and gas industry specifically? I know you're not in the oil and gas industry specifically, but you are oil and gas adjacent, that might surprise most people in Washington.
Um, I don't know if it will surprise people, but I think it's interesting. Uh, I look at energy technologies for a living. How do they work? What do they cost? Which ones are real? Which one's going to change the world? And just something I see in that space is that um, people tend to support technologies the way they support soccer teams. Like,
Mm,
this is my technology. I'm a fan of this technology. When I was a kid, um, you know, my family are big Arsenal Football Club supporters in the UK. When I was about 7 years old, we got beaten by Tottenham. And I told my dad, maybe we should switch and support Tottenham. And, he basically,
heresy.
I'm lucky he didn't kick me out of the house. I'm lucky I'm lucky I didn't end up in an orphanage. And, I think a lot of people kind of view technologies the same way, which is like, I've just got my ones that I'm behind those ones and I support them, whatever the facts. And I think one of the things that is just the hardest and most important things to do as somebody who's like watching technologies is when something emerges as a better technology, you have to get behind it and have to avoid kind of the trap of I intuitively really like this one and I support it. Um, and just look at numbers and the economics and what those numbers actually
Yeah.
say. So that's my fun closing
Okay.
thought.
Like that. Like that. Well, Rob, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a really fascinating discussion and I think a really unique perspective. So thanks for joining us on the pod. Appreciate it.
That was really fun. Thank you for the great discussion, Anne.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us for another episode of Longer Laterals. Please let us know what you think and join us again next time.